Hello, old school comic book reviews. This is kind of a response to a couple of videos I've seen called Why I Like Comics and What They Mean to Me. I've seen one by F.W. Waller, Ziploc Bloody, Comic Book Fan 1234. I think the original one was by Sly Cooper 88. And I think I've also seen one by Deadpoolzilla. I'm just gonna kind of ramble a little bit here. I'm a little bit older than a few of those guys, so my perspective a little bit might be a little bit different. But I can remember being really young and having like comic books around the house for some reason or another that like older relatives had given me, and I was like really young. I mean, I was literally too young to even read them. I would just look at the pictures and things like that. One of the first ones I remember was a Batman comic book, and I know what it is now because years later when I became a teenager, I ended up getting that comic book again, and seeing it at like a flea market or whatever, and just that memory triggered, and I found it again. But it was an old issue of Batman, and like I said, when I was a real little kid, I couldn't even like read it. I used to think for a period of time I thought Batman could fly because of the way that Neil Adams had drawn him. He was leaping from one place to another, and he was kind of leaning forward. And to me, as a young child, I thought he was flying. But I know some of the comics that were around, like I said, when I first had them, I couldn't read them. Years later, when I ended up being able to read them, then I knew what they were. But there was a Thor comic around. There were some DC War comics. I know there was an old Silver Surfer that I know my older cousin had given me. I know there was like Millie the Model or whatever. But, they were just around. And I think, as I got older, and like I said, being 8, 9, 10 years old or whatever, yeah, I had some like Spider-Mans and things like that, my mom got me or whatever. But I didn't really get into comics till like, a few years later. And the way I really got into them was, I was in grade school. I might have been, I'll say like about fifth grade sounds about right. I was friends with this one kid at school. I went over to his house, and it was him and his older brother. His brother was 1 year older than us, and they had this like massive comic book collection. I don't actually, thinking back, I really don't know how really big it was, but it was big to me. They had brought them all out, and they like spread them out on the living room floor, and I was just really impressed. They had all these comics, and they were mostly Marvel comics. I remember him and his brother were like big Incredible Hulk fans. They were big Avengers fans, and I was just really taken by it. I was really fascinated. They had this, like I said, to my eyes at that time, there were all these comic books, and there were all these different characters, and everybody had their own little story going on. They had their own villains, and it was just really fascinating to me. And that's how I got into it. And then I started, being able to go out and buy comics by myself. And this is like the old days. Like I said, I'm pretty old, so I can remember being a young kid, and if my mom gave, we really didn't have a lot of money back in those days, but if my mother gave me like $1 to buy a comic, this is like right at the end of the time when you could buy comic books for like 30 cents, and I thought I was a big shot, yeah, I got a whole dollar, and I can buy 3 comics. And then, right after that, then they went up to like 35 cents, and I was like bummed because I couldn't get as many comics anymore. I had to like scrounge up another extra 5 cents so I could get that third comic. But anyway, yeah, I was just really taken by it. Like I said, I would buy some DC comics, but I was more of a Marvel kid at that time. And, just really be taken, like I said, by getting into like the backstories at the time, and at that time the local television shows or television stations would show those reruns of those old 60s Marvel comics cartoons, when Captain America throws his mighty shield and all that stuff. And as kids, we all knew that the animation was taken directly from those old 60s comics. and that just increased our fascination, or at least my fascination, with the whole thing about how everybody had their own backstory, and there was a history to the characters, there was a history to the comics themselves. And I was just really into it. I mean, I could say I was really, 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 really into comics, like really during like the early '80s and things. And that's back when, and I just want to say, that's at that point I had gone from just being into the characters to then understanding that guys drew them. So then I liked certain artists, and then like right around that time, being old enough to understand that, somebody actually wrote these stories. So then I was aware of the art, the artists and the writers as well. And just really being into some of the stuff that was coming out at that time. Frank Miller was still on Daredevil. John Byrne was on, the Fantastic Four. Um, Marv Wolfman and George Perez were on, the new Teen Titans over at DC, and I just had a lot of fun with comics at that time. I probably follow a lot of other people of kind of like being into it for a few years, maybe being around 18 or so, kind of getting out of it or whatever. And I remember maybe a year or two later, being, just a couple of my friends were over at my house one day. And as on a kind of like a whim, one of the guys was like, hey, you know what we should do? Remember when we were in comics back in grade school? We should get back into comics again. Just as just like a lark, let's just do it as a fun, goofy habit. And so, getting back into comics, and then that's when I started getting, really good runs of things. I had a really big run of like Avengers and things like that, and just for the sake of disclosure, I don't have a third of the comics I used to have anymore for a bunch of personal reasons. I don't have like any of that stuff anymore. But anyway, being able to go back and get like, back issues of things, and like really get into like understanding the history of comics, and finding out at that time too, you had like the rise of more independent comics or independent comic book companies, companies like, the ones I was really aware of were like First Comics and Eclipse Comics. I know there was another company called Pacific Comics, but I think they had gone out of business at that time. And just being really aware that, there were other companies out there besides Marvel and DC, and that they had all these other like characters, besides, just Spider-Man and Batman and stuff. And, just that really kind of expanded my kind of awareness of comics as, comic books and the comic book industry and the history of things like that. And also, just realizing, and also finding out that there was this whole thing of like alternative comics and underground comics, and going back and finding out about all this weird stuff that came out in the 60s and 70s, the kind of counterculture type thing that was going on. And just realizing too, another thing that made comic books good, and, or I should say interesting and fascinating as a medium, that, it doesn't just have to be, Marvel and DC. It doesn't just have to be superheroes. You could tell other types of stories. You could tell horror stories. You could tell science fiction stories. You could tell, slice of life stories. You can tell, satire. You can do political satire. You can do, wacky things. You can do avant-garde art things. Comic books are really, you can do almost anything with comic books that you can do. Anything you can do in like almost any other medium, you can do in comics. They're just another way of telling stories, you know what I mean? A lot of people talk about how, comics are like cinematic, and they are, but, there are other ways that comic books will use that blend of words and pictures to convey a certain idea or communicate a story to you that's really unique. And in certain ways it can be really powerful and dramatic. In other ways it can be really introspective. And I think that's what's really great about comics. Like I say, you could tell the story about, your breakup, or you could tell the story about what happened down at the Rock and Roll story. Then you could turn around and tell the story a big, Star Wars fantasy science fiction story. You can do it all, You can do a grim and gritty street level story, and you don't have to choose between one or the other. I think comics can encompass all of those things, and that's what I think is really great about comics. I mean, you can really engage your imagination and take you to places where take you places where you couldn't go otherwise. And I think on the other hand, it could really say something about the world we live in, about the world around us, about society, about how we feel about our fellow man, and so on and so forth. So I think that's what's really great and what's really unique about comics. I think the other thing though is sometimes, I mean, that's why I feel is, well, let me jump back to the side part of it. It's a cool hobby. It's a fun hobby. If you're somebody that's like really into, the collecting aspect of it, like I said, I don't really, try to get, every issue of every run and things like I used to, several years back. But, I know what that's like. Sometimes that's fun when you find that you go to the local comic book store, or you order something, or you trade with somebody and you find that issue, you find that one issue that you're looking for, that will complete your run of this artist on this character, or you've got the whole run of this title, or whatever, it's a cool thing. It's a fun thing when you get out there in the community and, you meet people. Sometimes you meet people at the comic book store or conventions. I don't go to a whole lot of conventions these days, but I know what that's like. That is fun. I mean, it's cool to like communicate with people here on the internet, here on YouTube or websites or forums or things like that, That's another really cool, fun aspect of it. What I was going to say a moment ago is sometimes it's kind of a drag, like these days, where it seems like the big companies are, just trying to make. It's a weird thing to say that, they're just trying to make money. Well, of course they are. They're companies, Of course they're trying to make money, but it's a drag when you see more and more gimmicks and more weird stunts out there that look like they're just there to drain money out of your pocket, Like I said, of course, gimmicks are cool. It's cool to have the occasional foil cover or the occasional variant or whatever, It's just like when you buy Cracker Jacks and you get that prize in the bottom. But the thing is, you don't buy that box of Cracker Jacks for that stupid prize, You buy it because you want some Cracker Jacks and they're tasty and they're fulfilling and whatever, you know what I mean? But nowadays it just seems like sometimes the events and the gimmicks and the bags and the whatever, are taking precedent over the stories and the characters, and I think that's a drag. And I wonder how much that stuff is a hindrance to other people who are trying to get into comics or whatever. Maybe they see the cartoon shows, maybe they see the Justice League show, or they go see the Iron Man movie or whatever, and they want to know more about the characters, and then maybe they go into a comic book store, and I don't know, maybe certain people are overwhelmed because, you can't just buy Deadpool or Wolverine, Wolverine doesn't just have his one or two comics in the X-Men. He's on all the X-Men teams, and he's got 3 or 4 comics, and then some mini-series, and then he's over in all the Avengers comics, He's in stupid comics he has no business being in, but that's that's not a whole nother thing. Cause, I grew up with these characters. I love all these characters, whether I think this art is good or this story's bad or whatever, I don't hold it against the characters, but I get mad at like the management down there at the big companies where it seems like they're exploiting these characters, and instead of trying to come up with new ideas or different concepts to bring different people in there, they don't make it easy for people who's like the casual fan, and I wonder if that just turns people off. I don't know, I could be wrong, maybe some people just dive in, but, hey, I'm a guy that, has been in and out of comics for years, and I get daunted. I look at, the next event thing, and I'm like, man, I can't be buying 30 comics to get this one story or whatever. But anyway, I'm starting to get into the whole other thing or whatever, you know. But just going back to like why comics are good though. Like I said, you know, you could tell all types of stories with comics. You could tell personal stories. You can tell big, spectacular stories. You know, I always think it's cool when I do go into a comic book store and I see like some dad or some parent bringing their little kids in there. You know, I think it's cool when I see like, you know, some young lady or some girl who looks like they might be, you know, 18, 19, 20, college age or whatever, go in there and buying Buffy or something like that. I always think that's great. You know, I always think it's cool when more people get into the comics or get into the hobby or the scene or whatever you want to call it. So, and I think it's a cool way to like share your ideas, to share, to share a fun hobby and things like that, you know. So anyway, that's my 2 cents. Like I said, I'm responding to the videos these other guys made. You know, maybe somebody else can make their own video. If you got a comment to leave me, you know, go for it. Thanks and have a great day. Take it easy.